Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. The sun was up when I woke, and the coast of Italy was in sight. We had come straight across the Adriatic and were now sailing southwards along the Italian coast. I had spread my sleeping bag on deck by one of the guns, and, propped on my elbow, I could see the church towers and whitewashed houses of the little towns that stretch almost continuously along the east coast of southern Italy. In another hour, we would reach our destination, Bari, which had been captured by the 8th Army not long before. I got up, rolled up my sleeping bag, and went below to shave in preparation for my return to the outside world. I had not been in Italy since 1939. Before the war, I had known it well. Since my last visit, the Italians had become first our enemies and now, by another swing of the pendulum, our co-belligerents. It seemed strange to be going back. Vaguely, I wondered what it would be like. It was, needless to say, much the same. The sun was shining, and the Italians were busy basking in it. At every street corner, good-looking young men, some in uniform, loafed with their hands in their pockets and cigarettes hanging out of the corner of their mouths. On the walls of the harbour, in letters a yard high, the Duce's inscription still proclaimed, "Vinceremo, victory will be ours." Clearly, it would have been a waste of energy to rub them out. They were the kind of inscriptions that did equally well whichever side you happened to be on. In the Hotel Imperial, which the army, I was glad to find, had not yet had time to take over, there were hot baths and plenty of food and wine, and officers on leave from the front danced with nursing sisters to the animated strains of an Italian jazz band. Lili Marleen. They shouted, and Lili Marleen the Italians played, just as they must have played it for the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht officers a few weeks before. But I had hardly had time to take it all in before I had been swept on board an airplane and was far out over the Mediterranean on my way to Cairo. At Malta we came down, circling low over the stony little fields and the bomb-scarred houses of Valletta. Lord Gort, the governor, wanted to see us, and we went to have a drink with him, a reassuringly solid figure amidst the Italianate magnificence of Government House. Then we took off again and, falling asleep, I woke to find myself high above Libya, flying eastwards along the coast towards Egypt. Looking down, I could make out Benghazi, then Dema, then Tobruk and Sollum, and the Qattara Depression. Here and there, clusters of burnt-out tanks, planes, trucks, and guns, together with a myriad tracks, still scarring the desert, showed where 1, 2, or 3 years before, the fighting had been heaviest. We reached Cairo in time for dinner. I accepted gratefully an invitation to stay with Kit Steele, in whose comfortable house in Zamalek I had spent the last week before leaving for Yugoslavia, in the days when we were still debating whether Tito existed at all, and, if so, whether he was a woman or a committee. I had left all my kit there, and so, when I went up to my room, I found clean linen and a spotless tunic laid out for me, with highly polished buttons. My filthy battle dress was discarded, and I emerged a perfect gabardine swine, as the leaders of military fashion in Cairo were known. From Steele, I heard why I had been so urgently summoned to Cairo. Mr. Eden, Sir Alexander Cadogan, William Strang, Oliver Harvey, and half a dozen other Foreign Office officials were there on their way back from Moscow, where they had been conferring with Molotov. Moreover, it appeared that an even higher-powered conference was going to take place somewhere in the Middle East, which the Big Three themselves would attend, and Cairo, in those days of roundabout communications, lay on the road to almost everywhere. If I was ever to get a decision on our policy in Yugoslavia, now was the time, and here was the place. We were to have dinner that night with Cadogan. As I lay in my bath, I reflected that the last time I had seen him had been in his room in the Foreign Office when I had handed him my resignation from the diplomatic service. It seemed a long time ago. Looking back on the few but crowded years between, it occurred to me forcibly how fortunate I had been in my decision and how lucky not to miss the experiences that had fallen to my lot in the intervening space of time. To me it was not disagreeable to look forward to a future full of uncertainty and insecurity, with none of the slow inevitability of a career in the government service, to feel myself, in however small a way, the master of my destiny. With my left foot, I turned the hot water tap full on and wallowed contentedly. We dined under the stars on the roof of the Muhammad Ali Club, eating and drinking, under the supervision of Kosti, that truly great maitre d'hotel, all the things that I had dreamt about in my hungrier and thirstier moments for months past, perfectly cooked and perfectly served. Around us, at the other tables, sat the collection of Egyptian pashas, Greek millionaires, exiled princes, high-ranking British officers, and cosmopolitan beauties that constituted caring society during the war. They gave an impression of great wealth and considerable elegance. It all seemed faintly improbable, but nonetheless agreeable. Contrasts, as I have said before, have always appealed to me, and this after the life we had been leading was one with a vengeance. Next day, I saw Mr. Eden and gave him a written report on the situation in Yugoslavia, which he undertook to pass on to the Prime Minister in time for his forthcoming meeting with Stalin and with the President of the United States, at the same time sending a copy to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. Verbally, I repeated my main conclusions, that the partisan movement was of infinitely greater importance than was generally realized outside Yugoslavia, that it was very definitely under communist leadership and firmly orientated towards Moscow, that as a resistance movement it was highly effective and that its effectiveness could be considerably increased by Allied help, but that, whether we gave such assistance or not, Tito and his followers would exercise decisive influence in Yugoslavia after the liberation. When I flew back to Italy, nothing had been decided, but my report had caused something of a stir, and I was under instructions to return to Cairo in a few weeks, when, I gathered, Mr. Churchill himself would be there. In the meanwhile, I was to go and fetch the partisan delegation and bring them back with me. This was easier said than done. At Bari, the news that greeted me was bad. The German offensive was in full swing in Bosnia and Dalmatia, and the way to the coast was definitely blocked. Not even single couriers were getting through. If Rebar and Milojevic were to come out, an airplane would have to be landed to pick them up. I sent a signal to Jages, asking whether our carefully prepared landing strip at Glamouk was still in partisan hands. The answer came back that it was, but was unlikely to remain so very much longer. There was no time to be lost. The reluctance of the Royal Air Force to let us have one of their aircraft for a fancy job of this kind must be overcome, and an attempt made before it was too late. The high-powered instructions that I had brought back with me from Cairo were a help. I went down to the headquarters of the Tactical Air Force to see Air Vice Marshal Broadhurst and came back with the promise, in principle, of an aircraft. The question now was, what sort of aircraft? If the operation was to be carried out at night, it would have to be something that did not require too elaborate landing arrangements, for at Glamouk, there would be no lights except a few bonfires, and the runway, to the best of my recollection, was distinctly undulating. If, on the other hand, we were to go in by day, we would need something that could hold its own against enemy fighters, which, at that stage of the war, were fairly thick over Yugoslavia. I explained this, diffidently and, I felt, rather amateurishly to the Tactical Air Force. They were not impressed. They had, they said, plenty of far better uses for their aircraft than smashing them up in futile attempts to bring futile foreigners out of the Balkans. Nothing they had could land at night under the conditions described except a Lysander, and that was too small and would probably never get there. As to a landing by day, any aircraft that could carry passengers would almost certainly be shot down by the first enemy fighter it met. It was at this stage of the proceedings that an entirely new character appeared on the scene. Realizing the importance to us of air operations, I had asked the Air Officer Commander-in-Chief, Middle East, Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, for a good air liaison officer, someone, I specified, with plenty of ordinary operational experience and at the same time with a taste for irregular activities of the kind in which we were engaged. The result was Wing Commander John Selby, DSO, DFC. It had taken some time to find him, but, when in the end he arrived, we agreed that he had been well worth waiting for. John Selby's principal characteristic was his overwhelming enthusiasm. A large, plump, jolly man, he threw himself into whatever he was doing with an exuberance that at times was positively alarming. Before the war, he had been an announcer on the BBC. Now, within a comparatively short time of joining the Royal Air Force, he had become a spectacularly successful pilot of night fighters and mosquitoes. It appeared that he needed a rest from serious operations and was coming to us for a change. As a first step, he had taken a course in parachuting and demolitions and bought himself a grammar of the German language, which he spoke with vividness rather than accuracy of expression. He arrived at Tactical Air Force headquarters in a small and dangerous-looking airplane, which he landed with unnerving suddenness. Vivian Street, who had accompanied him, got out of it looking rather green. I sympathized and decided to keep out of it at all costs. I told Selby of my plans and of the difficulties that we were encountering. "Leave that to me," he said reassuringly, and went off to see a friend of his. Every Royal Air Force headquarters abounded with long-lost friends of John Selby. From these consultations, he returned shortly after with the promise of a Baltimore, a fast light bomber, which, he assured me, was just the kite for the job. "All we now need," he said, "is a fighter escort, and I can then go in by day." A fighter escort, however, was not so easy to come by. Glamour was out of range of all but long-range fighters, and nobody had any of these except the Americans. After some preliminary telephoning, I accordingly set out, complete with Baltimore, for American 82nd Fighter Group, then situated at Lecce, to see what I could pick up from our American allies. The 82nd Fighter Group had Lightnings. With their twin tails and bristling cannon, they were formidable-looking aircraft, like something out of H.G. Wells. They possessed sufficient range to do the round trip easily. It only remained to borrow half a dozen for an afternoon. The commanding officer, on being approached, said, "Sure, I could have them." He was a tall, dark, rather saturnine young man in his 20s, with a full colonel's eagle badges and a fine crop of decorations. His name was McNichol, and he had a great many German aircraft to his credit. We fixed a date for the operation a couple of days later, and I at once sent a signal to Robin Weatherly and Bill Deakin, whom I had left in charge at Jages, telling them to move the party down to Glamour at once and stand by there for our arrival. In addition to Rebar and Milojevic, the party for evacuation included Robin Weatherly himself, who, as an experienced regular soldier, would, I had decided, be a good man to watch developments on the islands, and Bill Deakin, who was going back to Cairo to act as my rear link with GHQ. With them to Glamour went our liaison officer, Vlatko Velebit, and Donald Knight, the sapper, whose job it was to get a landing strip ready for us. Next day, a signal arrived from Robin to say that they had all arrived at Glamour and would be ready to receive us there the day after. They would set fire to piles of damp straw, when they heard our engines, to guide us in by the smoke. "Very cold here," he added, "please bring rum ration." While we were waiting to start, I lived in the American mess, sharing a room with McNichol and his second-in-command, Major Litton, another ace fighter pilot. We had our meals in a vast mess room, all ranks eating together. The food was delicious, once you got over the shock of finding a sly dab of jam amongst your sausages, or a cube of pineapple with the meat. It included such delicacies as tinned grapefruit and Frankfurter sausages, and seemed unendingly varied after the monotony of our own rations. But the Americans grumbled about it. What they liked, they said, was that wonderful bully beef and meat and vegetable stew the British had. At supper, while we were eating our corned beef hash, McNichol would walk around the tables, picking pilots for the next day's missions. Then, next morning, after breakfast, there would be briefing. One would hear the roaring of the engines as they warmed up, and then the Lightnings would take off. In the evening, at supper, they would be back, talking of their experiences escorting the heavy bombers over Austria or northern Italy. Once or twice there were gaps at the tables, where someone had not come back. After supper, there was usually a film. In bed at night, as I dropped off to sleep inside a vast American Army sleeping bag, I could hear McNichol and Litton talking over the day's operations and the prospects for the morrow. Some weeks later, I heard that McNichol had been shot down and killed. The day appointed for my own venture dawned fine and bright. After breakfast, there was a briefing. At the request of McNichol, who was flying one of the Lightnings himself, I gave a short account of the situation in Yugoslavia for the benefit of any of our escort who might be forced to crash land or bail out. At the same time, I extended a cordial invitation to anyone who might find themselves in such a predicament to come and stay at my headquarters in the hills for as long as they liked. Then we went down to the airfield. My pilot and I, the rest of the crew had been eliminated to make room for the passengers we were to pick up, clambered up through the belly of the Baltimore. He showed me how the rear cannon fired and how the intercom worked. I fitted myself in as best I could, the engine roared, and we took off. Soon we were flying eastwards across the Adriatic, with the Lightnings wheeling and plunging around us until the sunlit sky seemed full of them. All was well that ended well. By the evening, I calculated, Rebar and Milojevic would be safely out of Yugoslavia, and we should all be on our way to Egypt. But I had reckoned without the Yugoslav climate. Beneath us, the Adriatic was a brilliant blue. The islands and the Dalmatian coast, when we reached them, were bathed in sunshine. Then, crossing the coast, we came to the Dinaric Alps and, climbing to fly over their jagged crests, suddenly found ourselves enveloped in a blinding snowstorm. Turning back, we skirted along the mountain range, looking for a gap. But it was no good. Along the whole length of the range, there stretched a forbidding, impenetrable wall of black storm clouds, marking, as it were, the frontier between one climatic system and another. There was nothing for it but to turn back and try again another day. Over the wireless, we consulted the lightnings. They thought so too. Soon we were all heading back to Italy. The next day we repeated the attempt, with the same result. The sea and the Dalmatian coast were bathed in sunshine, but once again, over the mountains, we ran into the same insuperable barrier of cloud. When we got back, I found a rather plaintive signal from Robin Weatherly asking when we were coming and reminding me about the rum. The outlook was poor, for I knew that the Americans needed all their fighters for some days to come to escort the heavy bombers on a series of all-out attacks on targets in northern Italy. The day after, I asked my pilot, a cheerful young New Zealander, if he thought we really needed an escort. He said that unless we had bad luck, he could probably get away from anything except a very up-to-date fighter. I asked him if he would get into trouble if we went without an escort. He replied cheerfully that if we came back safely, no one would say anything, and if we didn't, it wouldn't matter anyway. This seemed sound enough logic, and so we sent off a signal to Robin, announcing our arrival, and set off on our own. The weather was fine when we started, and we skimmed across the Adriatic, just above the crests of the waves, keeping well out of the way of marauding enemy fighters. As we approached the coast, we began to climb, leaving Vis, Korčula, Hvar, and the other islands far below us. There was cloud over the coast, but this time it was not so thick, and through the gaps, we could see the town and harbour of Split, with its dockyards and shipping spread out beneath us. Evidently, we too could be seen from the ground, for almost immediately, shells from the city's anti-aircraft batteries began to burst around us in white puffs of smoke. Soon we had left the coast behind us and were in the hills, flying over the same barren, rocky country through which I had tramped on my way down to the coast in the autumn. From the air, the mountain tracks were discernible as thin lines winding across the grey rock face. But as we flew inland, the cloud grew thicker, and patches of snow began to show on the hillsides. Caught in sudden air currents, the little bomber lurched and jolted sickeningly. For several minutes at a time, we would be flying through dense white cloud, then, with unnerving suddenness, a dark hilltop would plunge into view alarmingly near, and the pilot would swing the aircraft upwards or sideways to avoid it. I held on tight. Peering first out of the side window and then, rather gingerly, through the gaping hole in the floor, I tried to make out where we were. I could see nothing but a blanket of mist, with, projecting from it, half a dozen nondescript mountain spurs. I was contemplating these gloomily when a buzzing from the intercom indicated that the pilot wanted to talk to me. I put on the headphones. "We're over the place now," he shouted. "Hold on tight, I am going to try to get under the cloud." I held on tighter than ever. There followed some minutes of plunging and swerving through white obscurity. Then the intercom buzzed again. "It's no good," the pilot said. "I can't make it. We may as well go home." It was maddening to think of the partisans, with Robin Weatherly and Bill Deakin standing in the snow a few hundred feet beneath us, listening to the sound of our engines as we circled around and peering upwards through the mist. I was wearing a parachute, and for a moment, I considered an impromptu jump. But apart from the pleasure which it would have given me to see my friends again, this would clearly have served no useful purpose, for the partisan mission would have been as far from Cairo as ever. So, reluctantly, I signified my agreement to the pilot, and once again, we turned for home. Even now, our troubles were not at an end. Crossing the Adriatic, we found the whole of southern Italy enveloped in a vast thunderstorm. The rain streamed down in torrents, and great mountains of dark cloud, shot with lightning, towered over the coast. At Lecce, we found we could not land because of low cloud. From the ground, they suggested that we might try Foggia, 150 miles to the north. There, we found visibility no better than at Lecce. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, and our petrol was running out. There was nothing for it but to make the best landing we could and trust to luck. As we finally skidded to rest on a waterlogged airfield, after prolonged circling through successive layers of cloud and rain, I felt that I had had enough flying for one day. The next 48 hours we spent grounded at Foggia in a downpour of rain, vainly trying to communicate with the outside world over a singularly shaky field telephone. When, 2 days later, we finally reached Bari, events had taken a new and surprising turn. A signal had been received from Robin Weatherly to say that the partisans had succeeded in capturing a small German airplane intact and were proposing to fly the party out in it at once. There was barely time to warn the Royal Air Force and the anti-aircraft batteries not to shoot down a small aircraft with German markings, coming from the direction of Yugoslavia. Then we settled down to wait for news of the party's arrival in Italy. The signal, when it came, was from Bill Deakin, still in Yugoslavia. The news it brought was bad. The captured aircraft had duly been brought to the landing strip outside Glamak at dusk on the evening before the day fixed for the flight. There, it had been filled with enough petrol, it was hoped, to carry it across the Adriatic. Everything had been done to keep the move secret and to avoid attracting attention. At first light on the appointed day, the party had assembled on the bleak windswept plain. It was bitterly cold, and the engine took some time to start. As the pilot, a deserter from the Croat Air Force, was warming it up, the passengers and those who had come to see them off gathered around the aircraft, but there was no time to be lost. It was at this moment that, looking up, the little group around the aircraft saw, coming over the crest of the nearest hill, a small German observation plane. Before they could move, it was over them, only a few dozen feet above their heads. As they watched, fascinated, two small bombs came tumbling out. One fell near where Robin Weatherly and Bill Deakin were standing, and without exploding, came trundling over the ground towards them like a football. Robin, who saw it first, clutched at Bill's arm to warn him, and they both threw themselves to the ground. As they did so, the bomb exploded, killing Robin, who had not been quick enough. The other bomb burst full on the aircraft, destroying it completely and killing Donald Knight and Lola Rebar, and wounding Milaj Milajevic. Then, having dropped his bombs, the German flew off, machine gunning the survivors as he went. Afterward, we learned that a traitor had warned the enemy, whose nearest outposts were only a few miles away, of what was afoot. It was sad news indeed. In Robin Weatherly and Donald Knight, I had lost two good friends and two of my best officers. In Lola Rebar, the partisans had lost yet another of their outstanding younger leaders, and one who had seemed destined to play a great part in building the new Yugoslavia. For his old father too, whose other son had been killed in action a few weeks before, it would, I knew, be a crushing blow. We had paid heavily for the 2 or 3 weeks it had taken to reach a decision as to the movements of the delegation. Now one of them was dead, the other wounded, and Cairo as far away as ever. But the Yugoslavs had not given up the idea of dispatching representatives to Cairo. Velibit, our liaison officer, who had been standing by the aircraft at the time of the bombing but had somehow escaped injury, was appointed to take Rebar's place, while Milajevic was to go to Cairo too, wounds or no wounds. Once again, I set about trying to find an airplane and an escort. Meanwhile, fierce fighting was in progress in Bosnia, and the landing strip at Glamak seemed unlikely to remain in partisan hands for much longer. This time, the operation was given a higher priority, and on the first fine day, I set out for Glamak in a troop carrying Dakota, lumbering along massively, while half a squadron of lightnings circled and twisted around us, suiting their pace to ours. John Selby, on his way in to join my headquarters, was amusing himself by flying the aircraft, while the pilot, who had no doubt heard of his exploits in night fighters and mosquitoes, looked on in awe. The flight, under John Selby's expert guidance, was uneventful, and presently, having circled the plain of Glamak and located the signal fires, our Dakota was jolting to a standstill on the uneven turf of the landing strip, as if it was the simplest thing in the world to land in the middle of an enemy-occupied country in broad daylight. The doors were opened, and we scrambled out. Snow lay on the surrounding hills, and a cold, blustering wind was blowing across the plain. Bill Deakin and Vlatko Velibit came running toward us. Above us, a lightning circled, on the lookout for the enemy. There was no time to be lost. Milaj Milajevic, wrapped in a blanket and lying on a roughly made stretcher, was hoisted gently into the aircraft. After him came Vlado Dija, another leading partisan, who had been dangerously wounded in the head and whose life, it was thought, might be saved by an operation. Next followed Anthony Hunter, who had been with the Croatian partisans and was coming out to report. Finally, at the point of Sergeant Duncan's Tommy gun, came Captain Meyer of the German Abwehr, who had had the ill chance to be captured by the partisans while on his way to visit a neighboring Chetnik commander, and was now being sent to Italy for expert interrogation. On his face was a look of blank amazement, which was perhaps scarcely to be wondered at if you considered his recent experiences. First, the ambush as he was driving peacefully along the road in his car; next, his few hours of captivity with the partisans, with, in the back of his mind, the certainty that death was imminent; then the journey with his hands tied and under escort, to this lonely spot, so well suited for an execution; and finally, when he was convinced that his last moment had come, the sudden appearance in broad daylight of an Allied airplane, by which he was evidently going to be removed to an unknown destination. To complete his bewilderment came a cordial handshake from one of the new arrivals who was anxious to make a favorable impression on everyone, and had, in the confusion, taken him for a partisan. As soon as all those who were remaining behind were out and all those who were leaving were inside, the doors were shut, the engines, which had been kept running all the time, roared, and we jolted off again in a successful, but somewhat unorthodox takeoff. As we rose abruptly into the air, we could see John Henniker Major, who had come to take charge of the newcomers, striding off at the head of his little party. The first landing operation to be carried out in enemy-occupied Yugoslavia had been successfully completed. At Bari, where we landed, feeling rather pleased with ourselves, there was no one to meet us, and 1 or 2 explosive telephone calls elicited the information that no one had heard of us, that no arrangements had been made for our onward journey, and that no aircraft was available to take us to Egypt, where we were due the next day. This was deplorable. Clearly, someone had blundered. I was particularly anxious that the partisans should be impressed by the smoothness and efficiency of the arrangements which had been made for their reception, and it was only too clear that this result was not being achieved. Velebit, restored to civilization for the first time in 3 years, was looking about him without enthusiasm. Milijevic was evidently suffering great pain from his wounds. Dija, lying unconscious on his stretcher, his head wrapped in blood-stained bandages, his face a grayish-green, his breathing stertorous, seemed on the point of death. The Abwehr man, with Sergeant Duncan's Tommy gun still in the small of his back and with no one to take him away, was still looking bewildered. The pilot and crew of the airplane, having done what was required of them, had packed up and were preparing to go off duty. Clearly, if we were going to get anywhere, something would have to be done quickly. I put our problem to the captain of the Dakota. He explained that his orders had been to bring us back to Bari and no further. But, he added with a broad grin, if you were to give me a direct order to fly you on to Alexandria, it would be impossible for me to refuse. There will probably be a row afterward, but that will be your lookout. This was good enough. The direct order was given with alacrity, and the crew, who clearly fancied the idea of a trip to Egypt, immediately set about filling up with petrol and finding out whether Malta, where we would have to come down, was equipped for night landings. There only remained our German prisoner to dispose of. Eventually, after much searching, 2 military policemen, resplendent in their red caps, pipe-clayed belts, and shining brass, were found to take charge of him, and with these he went off, glad to see the last of Sergeant Duncan and finally convinced, I think, that he was not going to be shot. Then the rest of us, wounded and all, bundled back into the plane. The engines started up, soon we were far out over the Mediterranean. That concludes the 15th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.